Chapter 3. The Change I Never Got. When I went home the next day, I was confronted with the fact I had to invite my dad to lunch with Quirin. I walked inside and went into the kitchen where my dad was cooking breakfast for himself. I took a deep breath and cleared my throat. "Hey, Dad?" I spoke. He turned around, seemingly confused on why I was talking to him. Hey, Piper," he said, then turned back to his food. "So, I've been hanging out with Varian lately?" I held my breath, knowing he would say no, but I didn't really know any other way to start the conversation. He turned around once again. "Who?" "Piper, I don't know where you go when you go out," he sighed, looking at me frustrated. "My friend Varian, Quirin's son?" I groaned. He had to know who Quirin was. My dad had a look of realization. "Oh, Quirin's boy, you've been hanging out with him?" He tilted his head, almost as if I wasn't cool enough for Varian. "Ugh, yes. And Quirin wants to have lunch with you to discuss how often I sleep over." I rolled my eyes, marching further into the kitchen. I knew I had to be upfront and clear about what was going on to get him to do this. My dad shrugged. "How often do you stay over?" he asked. A large sigh came from me. "Like every other night? But you wouldn't know that since you never pay any attention to me." My dad waved his spoon dismissively. "I don't need to watch you. You're a smart girl," he stated, plain and simple. "But what if I get hurt?" I dramatically stretched myself across the table, hoping to get the point across. He said, reciprocating my dramaticness. I believe he was mocking me, but I digress. "Then someone will tell me. But you won't get hurt. I trust that." I sat up on the table. "What if someone does tell you? Like maybe I go to a science expo and get sucked up into a storm while having a panic attack?" I flailed my arms and laid back down. "What? I thought we were talking about lunch with Quirin, not storms at the castle," he laughed. I sat up, my dramatic expression turning serious. "Dad, that happened yesterday," I sighed. He tilted his head. "Oh yeah, it did. But I was told you had someone taking care of you." He shrugged. I gave another heavy sigh. "Whatever. Please, just go to lunch with them. Then we never talk about this again." I stood up, looking at him. "Fine. What's in it for me?" he huffed. Of course he wants something. I groaned and shrugged. "A lunch with Quirin? I don't know." He laughed. "Fine, if it means that much to you." He finished cooking his food as I sighed and went to my room. I sat up on my bed, then a knock came from my window that startled me. I crawled to the head of my bed and opened my curtains where I saw Varian. I opened the window and laughed. "Hey, bud, what's up?" He smiled. "Is your dad coming to lunch?" His freckles shined in the sun overhead. He seemed to be excited to meet my dad for some reason. "Yes, but I don't know if he'll remember. He barely remembers I exist," I joked. Varian frowned. He never really liked those kinds of jokes. I bowed my head and muttered in shame. "Oh, sorry." It's all right. Hey." He pushed a book onto my bed. "I found this book on psychology. Can I come in?" He looked at my pillow, which was pretty dirty. "Of course," I smiled. "Just take your shoes off. I sleep here." He tossed his shoes into my room. "Barely," he laughed, climbing onto my bed. "So psychology is like science, but, for your brain." "And what does the book say on it?" I looked at the thin book. The cover had a skinny woman, and the title read, "The Mind of Ladies." "Nothing useful," Varian stated. "But it's funny." He picked up the book and flipped to a random page. Listen to this," he put on a funny voice. "When a lady is upset, she may hide it so her husband is not disappointed." How crazy is that? Everyone should be allowed to be sad," he sighed, picking at the corner of the page. I nodded. "I guess." We talked for a couple more hours, Varian excitedly telling me about his new psychology research he had conducted based on our different living situations. After a couple of hours, we heard a call from outside my door. "Piper, let's go." I sat up and said, "Oh, you should go meet up with your dad before we get there." I smiled, standing up to make sure my hair was good. Varian nodded, climbing out my window and waving. The minute Varian was gone, my dad opened my door. "What's taking so long?" he complained. I picked up my bag. "I'm getting my things together. You don't even know where the lunch is. Chill." "Yeah, otherwise I would have left without you," he rolled his eyes. I skipped over to the front door, past him. We walked to Varian and Quirin's house, which was remarkably bigger than the other houses in the village. And remark my father did. "I almost forgot Quirin was friends with the king until I passed this every day." "Dad, please." I nudged him, then knocked on the door, and Varian swung it open. "Piper, hey!" He smiled, then looked at my dad. "Hello, Hello, sir. It's nice to meet you. I'm Varian. Varian extended his hand and smiled at my dad. Tenor Wilson. My dad shook Varian's hand, putting on a fake smile and straightening his back. He looked into the house and Varian gestured inside. Come on in. Dad, Piper and Mr. Wilson are here, Varian shouted inside, then led us to the kitchen. Quirin was at the table, setting up bowls. There was a salad in the middle of the table and a plate of buns next to it. My dad smiled. Wow, this looks wonderful, Quirin. Yes, I've worked hard gathering the vegetables for this. Quirin looked at my dad, then to Varian and I. Why don't you kids go play in the lab? Varian looked at the table. Only 2 places had been set. Aren't we eating, together? He asked. Quirin shook his head. Not today, he said, sitting down. All right. Varian grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the lab. As we left, I overheard my dad asking about Varian eating with Quirin. Then we were out of earshot. When we were in the lab, we talked about what our dads might be talking about. Varian suggested Quirin was asking about my home life, but I insisted they were talking about work. After a couple hours, a knock came from the door, startling the raccoon that had become an integral part of the team. Come in, Varian shouted. Both our fathers stepped into the room, my dad looking around the lab curiously. I think this was the first time he got a glance at my interests, and I was scared for a second, thinking he would find this too dangerous and tell me I wasn't allowed to hang out with Varian anymore. I was brought back to reality when Varian said, Can Piper stay the night? I have some things I want to figure out with her. And my dad's response was, Whatever, while he shrugged. I sighed in relief. What was I so worried about? My dad doesn't care. Yes, you may. Tenor, you should be on your way home. Quirin looked at my dad, who nodded and walked off. When he looked back, Varian was examining a rock that had sprouted in the corner of our lap. Varian, get back from it, he demanded. Varian jumped back and stood up. You kids should go out. You're always both cooped up in this lab. Yes, sir, Varian said, grabbing my arm. We both went outside as Quirin followed. After a while of playing outside, we snuck off to examine the rocks beside someone's house, going directly against Quirin's wishes. As we did so, we overheard people discussing the rocks. Apparently now was our time to shine, because Varian spoke up. We've been studying the rocks, and I think we discovered a vulnerability in their alchemical makeup, Varian said. Quirin approached us. Kids, I told you to leave the rocks alone, he huffed. I nudged Varian, signaling him to stop in case we got in trouble. Yeah, I know, but something has to be done, and I think we may be onto a solution. I panicked. My dad had never given me discipline much, but Quirin was much more strict than my dad. You may be onto a solution. I wasn't messing with the rocks. I giggled nervously. Quirin gave a large sigh, leaning to our level. No need to lie, Piper. And Varian, something is being done. In fact, I plan to travel to see the king this afternoon about this very matter, he sat up straight. Varian smiled. Oh, well, can we go with you? He asked. Quirin chuckled. Very well, you can travel with me, he returned Varian's smile. Varian was shocked for a second. Really? Yes! Road trip! Viper and Dad going to see the king. He grabbed my arm and smiled his big goofy smile. Oh, let's pack ham sandwiches. He pulled me toward his house. Quirin laughed at Varian's silly antics. Yes. In the meantime, stay away from those rocks. Varian looked around. Okay, but that's getting harder to do by the minute. We walked towards the house as a new rock sprouted beside us. As we walked into the kitchen to make sandwiches, I sat on the counter. Hey, Vari, I think I'm gonna stay back. Varian pulled out the bread and looked at me curiously. Why? He looked at the counter to cut the slices of bread. I sighed. I think I'm just not right to go talk to the king with you and Quirin. I shrugged. It was hard to put into words. What do you mean? He pulled out ham from the cabinet as I rubbed my arm. I mean, I think I'm, I don't think I'm mature enough for court. I stole the first sandwich he made since I had been starving. If you say so, though your dad seemed off. Maybe stay at my place while we're gone? He replied, cutting more for the ham sandwiches. I swung my legs, eating my food. Oh yeah, he's always like that around people. It's weird when he pretends to like me. Varian sighed and looked at me with concern. Just, please, stay here until we can, figure things out with your dad, okay? I laid across the counter dramatically. Fine, I chuckled and got down. Varian gave me a big hug, then left to see the king. I had the place to myself, so I tried to sample the rocks, breaking Quirin's best knife in the process. Oops, he won't notice, will he? I played with Rudiger for a couple hours. While doing so, a bunch of new rocks sprouted in the middle of the lab. I curiously looked at them, not wanting to do anything before Varian got home. When he did, he came bursting into the lab. He lied! I stood up, a sardine in my hand that I was going to feed to Rudiger. Who lied? About what? I went to Varian. My dad lied! About the rocks! He frowned and clenched his fist. We could hear Quirin call a town meeting from outside. But don't worry, Rapunzel promised she'd help. Varian looked outside the window as Quirin lied to the entire village, saying how he had told the king about the rocks. I sighed, placing a hand on Varian's shoulder. Running away isn't going to fix the problem. He pushed my hand away and went towards the rocks. These rocks must be stopped. Okay, guys, what do we know about them? I knocked on the rock, glancing at where I had hid the broken knife. They're unbreakable, I sighed. Varian nodded. They are somehow connected to the princess, he added, then pulled out a map he had made. And, worst yet, they are growing at an exponential rate. Within a matter of months, they will have reached the castle. He looked at Rudiger and I, then started mixing together chemicals. Well, now, physical force has no effects on these rocks, but they have yet to reckon with the awesome power of alchemy. He tried to pour something on the rocks, but I stopped him. Are you sure this is safe? I asked hesitantly. I was hoping to come across as concerned for him, but in truth I was more concerned we'd get in trouble. Oh yeah, totally safe. He tried the substance on the rocks, and a fire broke out. Yo, whoa! He quickly threw a blanket over the fire. We heard a voice outside. Kids, are you okay in there? I panicked. Yeah, we just dropped a book! As Varian hugged it, a boom came from under the blanket, and he said, One of our big books. We both chuckled quietly, Rudiger snickering with us. As we made more chemicals to try on the rocks, we noticed it started to snow. How lovely, I muttered gently. Yeah, it hasn't snowed in a while, has it? Varian walked toward the window, wiping the newly formed frost. I smiled. No, I guess not. Varian ran back across the room to get the new chemical he had just made. Alright, so the formula didn't deliver quite the reaction we had hoped. He looked at the new formula. So what? He approached the rocks. The important thing is, we got a reaction. Quirin suddenly came in and caught us red-handed. Kids, I wanted to... He looked at Varian. We both quickly panicked. Varian spilled a bunch of the formula on the rocks as he turned around, startled. Oh! Quirin approached us angrily. Children, I told you to stay away from the rocks. He gestured to the rocks, scaring Rudiger. Varian rubbed his head. Yeah, okay. I know what you said, but Quirin interrupted him. Then there should be no misunderstanding. He guided Varian away from the rocks. Piper, go home. But, sir, go home! I quickly whimpered away and watched from the door. Quirin whipped around to Varian. Now listen to me Varian pushed him. He was obviously angry. No, you listen to me, Dad. Our village is dying, and you think running away from the problem is gonna fix it? He gestured to the rocks. The chemical had still not given a reaction. Varian continued. No, these rocks are not going away, he snapped. Quirin put a hand on his forehead. I know, Varian, but there's more to them than you could possibly imagine. I gasped quietly. What did he mean? But that wasn't the biggest concern in the room. The chemical on the rocks had started to bubble as Varian shouted, Then why won't you tell me? Quirin walked past Varian as he continued yelling, Dad, I did deserve to know. I wanted to shout as the bubbling grew, but I had been sent home, so what would Quirin think? As Quirin approached the door, he took off his glove, but I couldn't see why. I'm sorry, son, but you are not ready. Quirin turned around and screamed what I had been thinking. Varian, watch out! He pushed Varian out of the way as the reaction burst and encased Quirin's arm in amber. Varian ran over. Oh, Dad, hold on, Dad. I'll get you out. Quirin pushed him away. No, stay back. Varian panicked. I'm gonna get help. I watched as Varian picked up a coat and ran past me, not hearing his father's protests behind him. I was too scared to go back into the lab, but this news was too much for me to go home. I went into the main house, shaking. It was all my fault for not telling them sooner. End chapter 3.